The email came in at 2:14 p.m. I remember the exact time because I checked it 3 times, convinced I had misread it. The subject line was stiff and fake formal. Something like notice of intended legal action, the kind of wording people use when they've watched too many courtroom dramas and think sounding official makes them powerful. My heart didn't race at first. It sank. Heavy, slow. Like my body already knew something my brain hadn't accepted yet. My half-brothers were threatening to sue me, not over some massive estate dispute, not over fraud or theft, but over $16,000, money I hadn't stolen. Money I was actively repaying. Money I never legally owed them in the first place. And in that moment, staring at the screen, I felt something break that I didn't even know I'd been holding together for years. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do, you know the feeling. That hot, crawling disbelief. The way your chest tightens while your mind scrambles to replay every conversation, every promise, every compromise you made just to prove to yourself that you weren't crazy. That you hadn't imagined being fair. That you hadn't imagined being kind. If you've ever bent over backward for family only to realize they were watching, waiting for you to slip, then stay with me. Like the video, subscribe, and listen closely, because this story isn't about money. It's about entitlement. It's about greed. And it's about what happens when the people who swear they love you decide you're easier to sacrifice than to respect. When I was 3 years old, my grandparents passed away within months of each other. At that age, death didn't mean much to me in words, but it meant everything in feeling. I remember their house vividly, the creak of the floorboards, the way my grandmother always smelled like soap and tea, the way my grandfather would let me sit on his knee while he read the newspaper, pretending I understood the words. They were stability in a family that, even then, was more complicated than I realized. They were planners, careful people. The kind who understood that love alone doesn't prevent resentment, and that money, especially, has a way of turning quiet tensions into wars, before they passed. They set up a savings account in my name. No one told me about it growing up. It wasn't used as a threat or a bargaining chip. It wasn't brought up when I asked for help or when my parents argued. It just existed quietly, untouched, accumulating interest, waiting. At the time, I didn't know it, but that silence around the account was intentional. My grandparents didn't trust people to stay fair once money entered the picture. When I turned 21, everything changed. I was finally told about the account. I remember sitting at the table, hands folded, trying to act calm while my heart pounded. The balance sat just over $300,000. I had never seen that much money in my life. But what stuck with me wasn't the number. It was the letter that came with it. A handwritten letter, yellowed at the edges, my grandmother's careful script looping across the page. It didn't sound legal. It sounded loving and cautious. They wrote that the money was mine. That part was clear, but then they asked something of me. They wanted me to share it fairly with any other Smith-Jones children. Not equally, fairly. They even explained what they meant. They wanted me to assess the situation myself, to judge what was fair, to trust my character. At the time, I thought it was a beautiful gesture, a vote of confidence. Looking back, I realize it was also a test. That wording mattered more than I understood then. My dad is a Smith. My mom was a Jones. They were married when my grandparents were alive. I never had full siblings, but I did have two half-brothers, Mac and Joe, my dad's kids with my stepmother. We grew up together, same holidays, same awkward family dinners, same forced smiles and photos. I never saw them as half anything. They were just my brothers, and even though, legally, the wording meant I didn't owe them a cent, I couldn't imagine keeping everything to myself. So I made a decision I believed was fair, simple, clean. Each of us would get $100,000. Me, Joe, Mac, no favoritism. No loopholes, no power imbalance. I even planned ahead, thinking that when Mac, the youngest, turned 21 and withdrew his share, whatever money remained in the account would be split evenly again. I wasn't trying to be clever. I wasn't trying to protect myself. I wasn't trying to control anything. I was just trying to honor my grandparents and keep peace in the family. When I turned 21, my dad suggested I use my share to buy a house. He sounded proud, almost relieved, like this proved something about him as a father. I found a small place I loved. It wasn't extravagant. It felt like independence. But it cost $130,000, and I couldn't qualify for a mortgage. That's when my dad suggested I borrow $30,000 from the account temporarily. Just borrow it, he said. Pay it back before your brothers need their money. It's still your account anyway. I trusted him. I trusted my family. So I did it. I withdrew the money. I bought the house. I started repayments immediately. I tracked everything. I didn't hide it. I didn't deny it. By the time Joe was about to turn 21, the account should have been sitting at $208,000 because of the withdrawal and the repayment schedule. It sat at $195,000, $13,000 short. $13,000 I fully intended to repay well before Mac touched the account. Then Joe turned 21, and everything changed. I sat with him, excited, proud, explaining how the money worked. How I'd structured everything to be fair. He asked to receive his share in installments, which I agreed to without hesitation. I transferred $50,000 to him that day. I remember smiling, feeling relieved, thinking this was going exactly how my grandparents would have wanted. Then, Joe looked back at the account balance. His expression shifted. His jaw tightened. His voice changed. He asked why there was less money than expected. I explained, calmly, carefully, about the house, about borrowing the money, about the repayment plan, about how everything would be restored long before Mac turned 21. I expected questions. I didn't expect suspicion. I didn't expect the look he gave me, like he was already building a case in his head. That was the first crack. The moment where fairness stopped being enough. And it was the moment I didn't realize yet would cost them everything. I knew something was wrong the moment Joe stopped responding like my brother and started responding like an accountant. His tone shifted first. The warmth disappeared. Every message became shorter, colder, more transactional. He didn't ask questions anymore. He made statements, the kind that sound reasonable on the surface but feel sharp underneath. Like someone gently pressing a knife against your ribs and smiling. While they do it, I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it, that money makes people weird for a minute and then things settle. I was wrong. Within days, Joe told Mac. I didn't hear it from them directly. I heard it through that familiar family grapevine that always seems to move faster when drama is involved. Suddenly, I was getting messages asking if everything was okay with the money, if I was sure I'd done the math right, if I'd thought about how this looks. That's when I realized this wasn't confusion. This was suspicion being fed and nurtured until it turned into accusation. Mac called me one evening. No greeting, no small talk, just straight into it. He said I had stolen from them. That word hit harder than anything else. Stolen, as if I'd sneaked around behind their backs, pocketed their money, laughed about it. I tried to explain again, slower this time, more carefully. I told him I was repaying it. I told him there was a timeline. I told him nothing about this was permanent. He didn't care. He said they were entitled to that money now. Not later, now. And not just the $13,000 I still owed, but interest too, $3,000 worth, according to them. Money they felt they would have earned if I hadn't touched the account. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the wall while my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I asked him where that number came from. He said it didn't matter, that it was fair, that they'd already been patient long enough. I reminded him gently that legally, they weren't entitled to any of it. I reminded him that this arrangement existed because I chose it. His response chilled me. He said legality didn't matter. What mattered was what they deserved. They gave me a deadline, 6 months. 6 months to restore the account to what they believed it should be, over $211,000. I did the math again and again, hoping I'd missed something. I hadn't. There was no way I could do that without draining my savings, selling my car, or taking on debt I couldn't handle. I told them I could do it over 2 years, the original plan. The plan they'd known about. They said that wasn't good enough. A few days later, they sent me a contract, an actual document, typed, Formal, cold. When I first saw it, I felt this strange mix of disbelief and sadness. These were my brothers. Not lawyers, not creditors. My brothers. I read through it slowly, my stomach twisting with every line. That's when I saw it. The 6-month deadline. Bold, non-negotiable. I called them immediately. I told them I wouldn't sign it, that this wasn't what we'd agreed on. They told me to figure it out. Those exact words. Figure it out, like my life, my stability, my mental health were inconveniences they didn't care to account for. Then they said they'd be seeking legal advice. That sentence sat with me like a threat that didn't need to be loud. I barely slept that night. My mind kept replaying every decision I'd made. Every moment I'd chosen generosity over self-protection. I kept thinking about my grandparents' letter, about trust, about fairness, about how wrong I'd been to assume those values were shared. The next day, the mail arrived. The one that changed everything. It was clearly written by them. You could tell. The awkward legal phrasing mixed with emotional language. They said they intended to sue me for the $16,000, not just the $13,000 I still owed, but the extra $3,000 in lost interest. They also claimed entitlement to whatever was currently left in the account. On top of that, they demanded damages, emotional distress, pain and suffering. I laughed when I read that part. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. They were accusing me of emotionally distressing them by giving them money. That laugh turned into something else very quickly. Anger, sharp, focused. I opened my banking app and looked at the transfers I'd already made. Joe had $50,000 of his share, $50,000 I hadn't been required to give him, $50,000 I'd given because I believed in fairness. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. I wrote back, calm, professional, controlled. I told them that legally, they had never been entitled to any of the money. That the arrangement existed because I deemed it fair, and given their current behavior, I no longer believed continuing it was appropriate. I told them that Joe would be keeping the $50,000 he'd already received, and that would be the end of it. No more payments, no negotiations, no contracts. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone lit up like I'd set it on fire. Calls, texts, emails, voicemails, accusations stacked on top of insults. They called me a liar, a thief, a manipulator. They said I'd gone back on our deal. They said I'd ruined the family. They said I was selfish, ungrateful, cold. The words blurred together after a while, but the tone stayed the same. Rage mixed with disbelief that I'd dared to say no. I blocked them. All of them. For the first time since this started, there was silence. I thought maybe that would be it. I thought they'd cool off. I underestimated how far they were willing to go when they didn't get what they wanted. They took it public. Within days, they were posting on social media, telling anyone who would listen that I was trying to steal their inheritance. They tagged me. They named me. They painted themselves as victims and me as the villain. Extended family members started messaging me, demanding explanations, telling me I should be ashamed, telling me I was tearing the family apart over money. Some of them didn't even ask my side. They didn't need to. They'd already decided who was wrong. I felt humiliated, exposed, angry in a way that made my hands shake. I wanted to scream, to defend myself publicly, to post screenshots and timelines and receipts, but something stopped me, a quiet instinct telling me to wait, to watch, to let them talk. Because when people get loud, they make mistakes, and that instinct turned out to be right. Because buried among the angry messages, one notification changed everything. A private message from someone I had never heard of before. His name was Chris Smith. He said he was 27, and he said something that made my blood run cold. He said he was my half-brother. I almost ignored Chris's message. At that point, my inbox was a landfill of accusations, threats, and unsolicited opinions from relatives who suddenly cared very deeply about something they didn't understand. One more message from a stranger felt like noise, but something about the way he opened caught my attention. There was no anger, no demand, just a careful, almost hesitant sentence. Hi. I know this is going to sound insane, but I believe I'm your half-brother. I stared at the screen longer than I'd like to admit. My first reaction wasn't shock, it was rejection. A quiet, instinctive no, this couldn't be real. My family was already complicated enough. I didn't have the emotional capacity for another twist. Then he sent another message, and another, not spammy, not desperate, just patient. He introduced himself as Chris Smith, 27 years old. He said he'd been trying to find me for years but never had a way to reach me. He explained that he only found me recently because my dad had shared Joe's post about the inheritance dispute, tagging me publicly. That post, the same one meant to shame me, had put my name directly in front of someone who had been searching for it his entire adult life. My chest felt tight as I read. I didn't respond yet, I didn't know how. Then he sent photos. The first one made my stomach drop. It was an old photo, slightly faded, of a little boy sitting on my grandfather's knee. My grandfather, the same crooked smile, the same living room, the same armchair I remembered curling up in as a kid. I recognized it instantly. Then another photo. This one had my dad standing behind the boy, his hand on the kid's shoulder. Another showed a family gathering. And then one that made my hands start to shake, a photo of me as a toddler, sitting on the floor, and Chris standing just behind me. We were in the same room, the same house. A moment I had lived and forgotten, a moment he had remembered. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Suddenly, this wasn't abstract. This wasn't some stranger making claims. This was someone who had shared space with me before I even understood what family meant. Chris told me everything slowly, carefully, like he was afraid one wrong sentence would make me disappear. He explained that he was one of my dad's children, from an affair, that my grandparents had known about him, that they had kept contact, that they had loved him quietly without blowing up the family. He told me they had set up a separate savings account in his name, $150,000. Along with it, a letter. A letter that said this money was meant to be shared fairly among my dad's illegitimate children. I reread that sentence over and over. Illegitimate children. The word felt heavy, outdated, cruel. And yet, there it was. Written in my grandparents' careful handwriting, decades ago. They had known. They had planned. They had protected everyone in their own way. Chris wasn't finished. He told me there was another half-sibling, an 18-year-old girl, younger than Mac, born after my dad had married my stepmother. My head started to spin. That meant my stepmother hadn't just been kept in the dark about past affairs. She'd been living in a lie while actively raising children with a man who was still cheating. I didn't respond for a long time. I just sat there, staring at my phone, feeling like my understanding of my family was being rewritten in real time. Eventually, I suggested we speak to a solicitor together. Not because I didn't believe him, but because if this was real, it was about to get very, very serious. The solicitor confirmed everything. The accounts, the letters, the wording, the separation. Legally, it was airtight. Mac and Joe, as legitimate children, had zero claim to the fund meant for illegitimate children. And as my half-brothers, they had zero claim to the Smith-Jones fund meant for children born within my parents' marriage. My grandparents had seen this coming. They had built walls between the money, not out of cruelty, but foresight. That's when I realized something that made my anger go cold and focused. My brothers hadn't just been wrong. They'd been wrong loudly, publicly, threatening lawsuits they had no legal basis for, trying to bully me into handing over money by shame and pressure. And now, their own actions had exposed secrets my grandparents had successfully kept buried for decades. I sent Mac and Joe a formal letter through a solicitor, calm, professional, final. I told them to cease and desist, to stop posting about me, to stop contacting me, and to enjoy the $50,000 Joe had already received, because that was all they were getting. No negotiation, no discussion. The same day they received that letter, Chris got a private message from my dad. My dad asked if Mac and Joe could have some of Chris's fund. Reading that message felt surreal. The audacity was almost impressive. After everything, after threats, after public humiliation, after trying to sue me for money they were never entitled to, my dad was still trying to redistribute someone else's inheritance to keep the peace. Chris said no, calmly, clearly. He also told my dad that we had met, that we knew about each other, that the secrets were out. I told Mac and Joe about Chris and our half-sister. With Chris's permission, I didn't soften it, I didn't dramatize it, I simply stated facts. The response was chaos. It turned out my stepmother had known nothing. Not about Chris, not about the younger half-sister, not about any of it. And when she found out, she didn't scream, she didn't argue. She told my dad to pack a bag and leave. He moved into a hotel that night. Last I heard, she wasn't letting him come back. She was consulting a lawyer. Mac was furious. Joe, already sitting on $50,000, refused to share a cent. Mac suddenly realized that his greed had cost him more than money. It had cost him trust, stability, and his parents' marriage. And through all of it, my dad kept calling me, begging me to reconsider, to make it right, to fix it, as if I had broken something, as if I hadn't been the one trying to be fair from the very beginning. By then, my sympathy was gone. I was done being the family's emotional shock absorber. I was done paying for other people's lives with my peace. The revenge wasn't loud. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't exposed anyone publicly. I had simply stopped protecting secrets that were never mine to carry. And the fallout had only just begun. Once the secrets were out, everything moved faster than anyone could control. Families like ours don't explode all at once. They crack. Slowly, quietly, in different rooms. I didn't need to be there to feel it happening. I could hear it in the tone of the messages I received, the desperation in my dad's voice, and the sudden silence from people who had been so loud when they thought I was the villain. The first thing that collapsed was the narrative. The story Mac and Joe had told online that I was hoarding money, stealing their inheritance, manipulating the family stopped making sense the moment more information leaked out. Questions started appearing under their posts. Why would the grandparents set up separate funds? Why was there a solicitor involved? Why had Joe already received $50,000 if I was supposedly refusing to give him anything? People don't like feeling manipulated, and once they realize they've been fed half-truths, they start digging. Behind closed doors, their house was turning into a pressure cooker. Joe had the money. Mac didn't. That imbalance became impossible to ignore. Mac was 19, watching his older brother sit comfortably on $50,000 while he got nothing but rage and regret. Joe refused to share. He said it wasn't his problem, that he'd secured his future and Mac should have thought ahead. Hearing that secondhand made my stomach turn. This was the same brother who had accused me of theft, now openly hoarding money without shame. My stepmother found out about Chris first. Not from me, not from my dad, from the fallout. From whispers, from the way conversations suddenly stopped when she entered the room. Then she found out about the younger half-sister, the one born after she married my dad. That was the breaking point. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was humiliation. Years of her life reframed in an instant. The man she trusted hadn't just cheated once. He'd built an entire parallel family structure behind her back, and everyone else had helped keep it quiet. She didn't yell. That's what people expected. Instead, she went cold, calm, controlled. She told my dad to pack a bag and leave. No negotiations, no explanations. He moved into a hotel that night. When people say a marriage ended over money, they're wrong. Money just exposes the cracks that were already there. The marriage ended because lies don't age well. My dad called me constantly during that period, sometimes angry, sometimes crying, sometimes trying to sound reasonable. He said I'd gone too far, that I should have handled things privately, that I'd embarrassed him, that I was tearing the family apart. I listened longer than I should have. And then I said something that changed our dynamic forever. I told him that none of this would have happened if he hadn't encouraged me to borrow money in the first place, if he hadn't raised sons who saw generosity as weakness, if he hadn't spent decades lying to everyone and expecting the women in his life to clean up the mess. He didn't have an answer to that. He just sighed, like a man finally realizing he was out of excuses. Extended family members slowly backed off. Some apologized, others disappeared completely. The loudest critics were suddenly quiet. No one likes to admit they picked the wrong side, so most people chose silence instead, and honestly, I welcomed it. The quiet felt earned. Chris and I talked more during that time, long conversations, awkward at first, then easier. We compared memories, shared stories, laughed at how absurd it all was. He wasn't angry, not at me, not even really at our dad. He'd grown up knowing the truth. He'd already done the grieving. I realized how different our paths had been. How carefully my grandparents had tried to balance fairness with damage control. They hadn't been perfect, but they'd been intentional. That mattered. The legal side wrapped up cleanly. No lawsuit, no courtroom drama. Once Mac and Joe spoke to an actual lawyer, reality hit them hard. They had no case, not against me, not against Chris. Threats evaporate quickly when facts show up. They didn't apologize. They just stopped. Which, in its own way, was an admission. What surprised me most was how light I felt. I had expected guilt, anxiety, doubt. Instead, I felt relief. For the first time since I was a child. I wasn't carrying responsibility for keeping everyone comfortable. I wasn't cushioning the truth. I wasn't paying emotional interest on debts that weren't mine. The revenge didn't look like victory from the outside. There were no speeches, no final confrontation, no dramatic mic drop moment. It looked like consequences, like watching people live with the results of their own choices. Like realizing that fairness doesn't mean self-sacrifice, and kindness doesn't mean compliance. Max stopped speaking to me entirely. Joe only reached out once, months later, asking if I'd reconsidered. I didn't respond. My dad eventually found a long-term place to live that wasn't the family home. My stepmother moved forward without him. The family didn't reunite. It reorganized, painfully, permanently. And through all of it, the money sat where it was supposed to, quiet, protected, exactly as my grandparents intended. By the time the dust settled, I understood something clearly. I hadn't destroyed my family. I'd stopped enabling it, and sometimes, that's the most powerful revenge of all. When everything finally went quiet, that's when it hit me the hardest. Not during the arguments, not during the threats, not even during the moment my family split down the middle. It was afterward, when there was nothing left to respond to, no messages lighting up my phone, no accusations demanding defense. Silence has a way of forcing reflection, and for the first time in months, I could actually hear my own thoughts without someone else shouting over them. I replayed everything from the beginning. The letter, my grandparents' handwriting, trust they'd placed in me without conditions or deadlines. I realized something then that I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. They didn't ask me to be fair because they were naive. They asked me to be fair because they knew exactly who they were dealing with. They understood my father. They understood how resentment festers when people feel entitled to something they didn't earn. They understood that money doesn't change people, it reveals them. For a long time, I wondered if I'd been too harsh. If I should have just paid the money back faster. If I should have swallowed the insults and smoothed things over for the sake of peace. That doubt crept in late at night, when the anger faded and the loneliness took its place. But every time it did, I reminded myself of one simple fact. I didn't start this. I didn't escalate it. I didn't threaten anyone. All I did was stop negotiating with people who mistook kindness for weakness. Joe never apologized. He kept the $50,000 and disappeared into his own life, occasionally resurfacing through other people with vague comments about how things got blown out of proportion. Mac carried his anger openly. He blamed everyone but himself, me, Joe, our dad, fate, anyone except the person who had chosen greed over patience. Watching him struggle with that bitterness hurt more than I expected. But it also taught me something important. You can't save people from consequences without stealing their chance to grow. My relationship with my dad changed permanently. We still speak, but it's different now, quieter, careful. He no longer lectures me about family loyalty. He no longer asks me to fix things, in a strange way. The collapse forced honesty where denial had lived for decades. He sees me differently. Now, Not as a daughter he can persuade, but as a woman who won't carry his secrets for him. That boundary came at a cost, but it also came with peace. Chris and I stayed in touch, slowly, naturally, no pressure, no expectations. Just two people learning what it means to share blood without history. We talked about our grandparents often, about how intentional they'd been, how they'd loved quietly but deeply. I felt closer to them through him, like a missing piece of their story had finally found its place. Our younger half-sister reached out too, eventually, careful, curious. I didn't rush her. She deserved time to process a truth she hadn't asked for. The money itself became irrelevant in ways I hadn't expected. It stayed where it belonged. Protected, untouched. It no longer felt like a prize or a burden. It felt like a responsibility I had honored, that mattered more than any number on a screen. I used my share wisely. I built stability. I built independence, and most importantly, I built a life where my worth wasn't measured by how much I gave up to keep others comfortable. Looking back, the revenge was never about punishment. It wasn't about watching anyone suffer. It was about refusing to be bullied into self-betrayal. The most satisfying part wasn't watching my brothers panic or my father scramble to fix what couldn't be fixed. It was the moment I realized I didn't feel guilty anymore, that I could sleep without rehearsing explanations, that I could breathe without bracing for the next accusation. If there's a lesson here, it's this: fairness doesn't mean equal pain. It means honest boundaries, and sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't doing something dramatic. It's doing nothing at all, no defending, no chasing, no fixing while the truth does its work on its own. So if you've ever been made to feel selfish for protecting yourself, remember this. People who benefit from your silence will always call your boundaries cruelty. That doesn't make them right. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, hit that like button, subscribe. And tell me in the comments what's the most satisfying consequence you've ever seen play out naturally. Because sometimes, karma doesn't need help, it just needs time.